Well, everyone in the mainstream, from corporate media to the government, have tried to character assassinate and marginalize the Occupy Wall Street movement as fringe. Well, it turns out the government has felt very threatened by the movement all along. Through FOIA requests, the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund has found that the Department of Homeland Security is working with local law enforcement agencies to conduct massive surveillance and information sharing in response to Occupy. So since police can't silence the movement, are they now trying to tarnish the group's reputation? Maria Verheyden-Hilliard, Executive Director at the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, joins me to discuss this. Sorry if I butchered your name.
It's Mara Verheyden-Hilliard. So it's close.
Close. So, Mara, doesn't this confirm what we knew all along, that these federalized crackdowns were really coming from the top down? And tell us more about these documents.
Well, in the fall of last year, when it was clear that there was a coordinated assault and attack on the Occupy movement all over the country, we filed a series of FOIA demands with various federal law enforcement agencies as well as local municipal, mayor's offices, police agencies. And what we're trying to expose right now and get our hands on is the communications, the documents that show the nature of federal and local involvement in the Occupy crackdown. Now, I don't think it comes as a surprise to anyone that the U.S. government is keenly aware and paying a lot of attention to a movement that's really inspired the country, particularly at a time of great social and economic injustice where people are standing up for themselves. And as we've demanded the documents, we've received waves of documents, most recently a series from the Department of Homeland Security.
It seems like a lot of Occupy activists aren't pointing fingers at the Obama administration and mostly just local law enforcement agencies at cracking down and what we've seen happen. I mean, these documents pretty much show that the DHS was directly facilitating these spying programs on Occupy.
Well, there's a couple of different elements here. One is you have the actual folks that carry out, the handcuffing, the arresting, the sweeping people out of our public squares. And that's always the local police usually that are, almost always, that are doing that. And then the question becomes, how involved is the federal government? Now, what we've seen so far is that the federal government is clearly monitoring, spying on the Occupy movement across the United States. We have documents showing that they were entering into federal databases, basically into fusion center collection databases, information like the names of people who were arrested demonstrating at the Bank of America in Dallas. Now, why is that going to be important to the federal government? It shouldn't be, and they shouldn't be collecting that information. And I should add, these folks were arrested for what looks like completely bogus and certainly minor offenses. We have the Department of Homeland Security reporting up to the highest levels in DHS and all across the country with regard to the planning of the Occupy movement in advance of the demonstrations at the ports last fall. And they are reporting, they're getting reports back on what plans do you have in place, what are you going to do with regard to the Occupy movement when they come out on that day. So we have that as well as issues of coordination with local police.
It did seem very strategic, all of it happening kind of, one right after the other, and really kind of the same methods that we saw. And I mean, we know that there was a mayoral call with someone in the federal government kind of coordinating these. Could you talk a little bit more about the fusion centers? What are they?
Sure. The fusion centers are basically a mass spying apparatus that the Department of Homeland Security has put in place in the United States. And they exist on sort of this regional, local, state level. And the way they operate is it's a way to sort of integrate all law enforcement to become basically folks that are conducting domestic spying, so that it's not just federal agents. What they do is they do what's called suspicious activity reporting, which means anything. There's basically no criteria to limit what gets reported and put into these data centers. They're in a way sort of informally deputizing the hundreds and thousands of local law enforcement people all over the country to report back to the federal government and to include information about anything that they deem suspicious. Well, apparently that is not focused on what one would reasonably consider to be suspicious, which would be something looking like criminal or threatening or violent terrorist activity. It's people engaged in political protest.
Would you say it's safe to assume that there's really the infiltration, let's say, of police at pretty much every large-scale Occupy group across the country at this point?
Well, at the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, we have litigated demonstration cases for, well over a decade, some of the largest demonstrations in the United States, where it's very clear to us that at demonstration after demonstration, local law enforcement goes in, not just as plainclothes, but as undercover, that they place people within the movement, that they have people who act as protesters. But we also think it's very important for people not to focus on and turn all their attention to, is the guy next to me a cop?
Who's the
right,
cop?
Because then, you're not focused on what you care about and the things that you're coming out in the street for. What you should do is recognize that that exists and to be very conscious of it and to not get set up the way the FBI are setting people up all the time, where, most of the so-called terrorist plots of the last 10 years have actually been created, orchestrated, and led by the FBI. People need to be aware, they need to be conscious, but they need to stand up for what they believe in. And if people get scared, then they're going to go back inside. And the most important thing that can happen is that people come out in the street to fight for social change.
Yeah, one has to wonder if this would create a chilling effect, or if that's what they're intending to do by, this information getting out. Everyone's kind of skeptical of who's in the group, who's an informant, et cetera. But let's talk a little bit about black bloc provocateurs. I mean, it's been noted in the past that there have been black bloc provocateurs that have turned out to be cops.
Yes,
in certain cases. I mean, do you think that it's likely that some of the violence that's been instigated by Occupy Oakland, I mean, there was a cop watch video that showed policemen dressed as Occupy members in there, and that's where we've seen the majority of this violence and these pretty aggressive crowd control methods on the activists. Do you think that that's a possibility for them to be actually instigating the violence themselves?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's a very important point. I think that, I know from our own litigation that we have seen undercover and officers come into peaceful protest groups. And in one instance that we litigated, they were actually telling a completely peaceful group that they should consider planting bombs on bridges, calling in bomb threats. That was coming from the police. And certainly when the police are able to conduct a violent operation or provoke people or engage in a violent operation, then they're going to be able to justify repressive tactics, and they're also going to be able to demonize a movement. So I do think that, we've seen it happen. I wouldn't be terribly surprising, and as you said, a lot of activists have their own evidence, their own videos of these guys that turn out to be cops.
Why is the federal government so afraid of people getting together in a public space to talk?
Well, the history of social change in the United States has really come not from above, not because there was a beneficial, benevolent elected person who then sort of looked down and said, I'm going to do right by the people. It's always come because there's a social change, almost revolution happening from below. And that people have come together to fight for what they believe in, whether it's the labor struggles, women's rights, civil rights, end of the Vietnam War. And that's what's always happened. And at the same time, we've always had police repression, we've always had demonization, and now we're in an election year, and every 4 years the people in the United States are told, go to the ballot box, and that's where you're going to find your solutions. But we're really seeing a time in American history where people believe there's something else to do.
Indeed, it always has come from the grassroots. That was Mara Verheyden-Hilliard, Executive Director at Partnership for Civil Justice Fund.